So our speaker today is Craig Jendza, who is the Associate Professor of Ancient Greek and Roman Studies at Denison University, and he was formerly of the University of Kansas and received his PhD from the Ohio State University in 2013. Building on the brilliant work he did there as a graduate student, he's the author of the 2020 book, Paracomedy, Appropriations of Comedy in Greek Tragedy, which was published with Oxford University Press. And this year, 2025, a book on Aristophanes' Wasps, part of the Bloomsbury Ancient Comedy Companion series. Currently, Craig is working on a book on horror in Greek tragedy and on humor in Greek comedy. And today we're sort of with the former, with his talk entitled The Erinyes and Aeschylus. I'll turn it over to Craig. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's great to talk with you and see you again, and it's great to see all of you. So thank you for coming out to talk with me. My talk's maybe about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for some discussion afterwards. So I'm a person who reads things from a piece of paper when I give presentations, so that's where we're at. Okay. So the history of the ancient Mediterranean, and actually I have a PowerPoint. Let me get that PowerPoint up too. Oh, Mark, can I request to be able to share screen? Excellent. And oh man, how do I do this, guys? There it is. Okay. Okay. So the history of the ancient Mediterranean is characterized by points of collapse and renewal, and the political theorist Antonio Gramsci calls the intersection between the two the time of monsters. And this, of course, gives us the topic for this year's conference. And this, I think, is a very aptly chosen metaphor, since it makes perfect sense to symbolically represent these points of social and political breakdown with monsters, whose very nature violates categories, think about werewolves or chimeras, and whose actions violate social norms. Think about the killing of humans and eating of their flesh. And in this paper, I'm going to be looking at a particular monster in a particular work. That's the Furies, or the Erinyes, as I'll call them in this paper, as they appear in Aeschylus's play, Eumenides. This is the third play in Aeschylus's tragic trilogy, the Oresteia. The first play, Agamemnon, featured the Greek hero Agamemnon returning home from Troy after the Trojan War and being murdered by his wife Clytemnestra. And the second play, Libation Bearers, saw their son Orestes murder Clytemnestra in response. And he's the one that gets hounded by the Furies, or the Erinyes, afterwards. So today's talk is part of a larger project I'm working on horror in Greek tragedy, and that's the lens I'm using to approach these Erinyes and this text. But I also think that the Erinyes can speak to the issue of collapse and renewal, and I'll circle back to that at the end. Okay. So within Greek tragedy, the terrifying animalistic chorus of Erinyes is highly unusual. So according to one well-known but likely invented anecdote, the Erinyes were so scary that at their arrival on stage resulted in children fainting and women having miscarriages. So it says, some say that at the performance of Eumenides, by leading out the chorus one by one, he, Aeschylus, terrified the people so much that children fainted and fetuses were aborted. Now, many scholars have thought that this story was kind of crazy and probably didn't happen. But, not only because of the unlikelihood of such an intense collective response, but also because the evidence is conflicting as to whether women and children were allowed to attend the theater. But the fact that such extreme audience reactions at the original production of Eumenides was even conceivable to the Greeks indicates that the Erinyes were frightening figures. So this paper is really not about whether they were scary or frightening or terrifying, rather it's about whether they're horrifying. And horror is a very neglected topic in the study of Greek tragedy. And in this paper, I'm going to argue that we should consider Aeschylus's Eumenides to be horror, that is, to be an ancient analog to our modern horror that we've got. Something like, Dracula horror fiction or horror film, things like Alien or any other ones. horror television like American Horror Story or musicals or theaters, this kind of genre that we're all familiar with. So I'm going to begin in section 1 by talking about horror and tragedy, how these two interrelate. Section 2, I'll talk about the Erinyes as horror monsters. I'm going to argue that these Furies, these Erinyes, function as horror monsters. And in section 3, I'll talk about some horror techniques, namely fusion and massification. Section 4, I'm going to look at suspense and how Aeschylus creates suspense as he's going throughout the Oresteia, the whole trilogy. And then section 5, I'll look back at that collapse and renewal that we kind of started with. So section 1, horror and tragedy. So we can start by saying that there's a strong overlap between horror and tragedy. And one reason for this is that both genres are aimed at the production of emotions. Now, some genres are defined in relation to their format, like musicals, others to their setting, like Westerns. Others are defined in relation to emotion, such as comedy, thriller, and suspense. And these three genres aim at the production of simple emotions, with comedy being aimed at mirth, thriller aimed at excitement, and suspense aimed at, well, you guessed it, suspense, right? But unlike these, horror and tragedy aim at complex emotions, more than one. In the case of horror, following philosophers of horror like Noel Carroll, that complex emotion is fear and disgust, sometimes framed as fear and revulsion. In the case of tragedy, following Aristotle, that complex emotion is fear and pity. And so we can see that there's some overlap between these two emotions, between the fear and disgust of horror and the fear and pity of tragedy. Now, this isn't to say that, this is the only relevant aspect of these genres. There's a lot more to it than that, just that these are core, definitional components. The emotion of horror, if we are to follow this philosopher Noel Carroll that I mentioned earlier, the account from his book, The Philosophy of Horror, or Paradoxes of the Heart, I just like that cover and that title. He says it's caused by some entity or an object, what we would call a horror monster. Okay, so this horror monster, according to Carroll, has a specific set of attributes that prompt the fear and disgust, that prompt the horror. So he says they're disgusting, viscerally revolting, impure, unclean, and indescribable. They're entities one doesn't want to touch nor be touched by. And they make the audience respond by shuddering, recoiling, shrinking away, feeling weak, feeling dizzy, feeling nausea. They're impure beings, often associated with things like dirt and slime and decay. Drawing upon anthropologist Mary Douglas's conception of dirt as matter out of place, Carroll relates the monster's impurity to the fact that they are indescribable. Their bodies are things like they're formless, like a blob, or incomplete, like an animate severed hand. They're categorically contradictory, things like living and dead, like vampires or zombies. Or they're categorically interstitial, and that just means that they possess attributes from two different categories, like a werewolf being wolf and man. So according to Carroll, horror monsters must be of supernatural or science fiction origin, something contemporary science can't explain. So on the slide, we have Dracula and the Wolf Man. Prototypical examples of horror do have such monsters, but other genres like fairy tales can have monsters too. So how can we distinguish between things like Dracula and the Wolfman, and then like Shrek and Chewbacca, which also seem to be monsters, but we wouldn't say that they're horror monsters? So as Carroll says, what appears to demarcate the horror story from mere stories with monsters like myths is the attitude of the characters in the story to the monsters they encounter. In works of horror, the humans regard the monsters they meet as abnormal, as disturbances of the natural order. And so horror depends to a large degree on how the internal audience, like the characters within the work, how they react to the monster, and also how we, as the external audience, react to the monster. And he says that those two audiences, the internal, the characters within, and us, they ought to have some sort of audience mirroring, what they're feeling when they shriek and freak out and recoil. That's the way we ought to feel as well. So section 2, the Erinyes, that's the theory stuff. So do the Erinyes, do the Furies count as horror monsters on this theory of horror? And so to establish this, we'll need to look at their physical appearance and their actions and the way people react when they see them. So within the play, our first impression of the Erinyes is right here. It comes not with our own eyes, but with the eyes of the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo at Delphi. And she tries to enter the temple and immediately backs out, saying, "Things truly fearful to speak of, fearful to behold with the eyes, have driven me back out of the house of Loxias," that's Apollo. "They've taken away my strength and made me unable to stand upright, so that I run on my hands instead of making speed with my legs. A frightened old woman is nothing, or rather, no better than a little child." So this is the equivalent of a horror movie scene where the external audience, us, sees the horrified reaction of a character perceiving the monster before we do. The sight of the Erinyes immediately produces fear in the Pythia, accompanied by the physiological responses of recoiling, shrinking away, and weakness. So according to Carol's account, the Pythia is experiencing horror, that's the emotion she's feeling, caused by the sight of the Erinyes. Next, the Pythia becomes more composed, and she manages to provide a precise, detailed description of Orestes. "There I see a man sitting at the navel stone as a suppliant for purification, a man polluted in the eyes of the gods, his hands dripping blood, holding a newly drawn sword in a tall-grown olive branch, recently adorned with a very long wreath of wool of snow-white fleece. By speaking this way, I shall make myself clear." Orestes has just killed Clytemnestra and is kind of covered in blood, and he's still got that sword in his hand. So the details that the Pythia provides are really specific. The location where he's sitting, the blood dripping from his hands, the sword being recently drawn, the fact that the branch was made of olive wood, the type of adornment on the olive branch, the color of the fleece. She can see all of this. And from her brief glance, the Pythia can see how the gods would see him, as polluted. The Pythia is even aware of how clearly she can relate this. She says, "By speaking this way, I shall make myself clear." And immediately afterwards, and in strong contrast to her clear, precise image of Orestes, when she tries to describe the Erinyes, she can't. She finds them utterly indescribable. She says, "In front of this man, there's an extraordinary band of women, asleep, sitting on chairs. No, I won't call them women, but Gorgons. But then I can't liken their form to that of Gorgons either. So they're sort of like women, but not women, sort of like a Gorgon or a Medusa, but not really that either. That's not quite right." So
Mm.
she's confused, and she's trying to figure out what's going on. So she says, "I did see before now in a painting female creatures robbing Phineas of his dinner. These are the harpies." He says, "These ones, though, it's plain to see, don't have wings, and they're black and utterly nauseating." So they're like the harpies, kind of, but not because they don't have wings. And unable to find anything in her past experience comparable to what she's seeing, she just describes them. They're black and utterly nauseating. She goes on, "They're pumping out snores that one doesn't dare come near, and dripping a loathsome drip from their eyes. And their attire is one it's not proper to bring either before the images of gods or under the roofs of men." So the Pythia characterizes them as disgusting, with snores you don't want to approach, and some sort of gross goo emanating from their eyes. The Erinyes are revolting to a variety of the senses: the sound and smell of the snores, the sight of the stuff dripping from their eyes, and maybe even the way the loathsome drip would smell if, and feel it if it was touched. The Erinyes are also impure. Their overall appearance, their cosmos, isn't proper in religious spaces or at home. This raises a question. If the Erinyes don't fit in within the realm of gods or men, where do they belong? The Pythia is not sure. She says, "I've never seen the tribe to which this company belongs, nor do I know what country boasts that it's reared this race without harm to itself and doesn't regret the labor of doing so." So according to the Pythia, the Erinyes belong not to gods, nor to men, nor to any other social grouping at all, nor to any kind whatsoever. They belong to no category at all. Even Apollo, who presumably has greater knowledge than the Pythia and more experience due to the fact that he's a god, has difficulty describing them when he comes out. "Fallen in sleep, these abominable old maidens, these aged virgins, with whom no god ever holds any intercourse, nor man nor beast either, why, they were absolutely born for evil. For they dwell in the evil darkness and Tartarus beneath the earth. and are hateful to men and the Olympian gods. Apollo refers to them in paradoxical terms, old maidens, aged virgins, and he reaffirms their lack of place in the world by stating that neither god, man, nor beast engages with them. And a very similar reaction to the Pythias occurs a little bit earlier in the trilogy, at the end of Libation Bearers, when Orestes has just killed Clytemnestra and he sees them pursuing them. No one else can, but he sees them. What he sees is very similar. I'm just going to cover it very briefly. He says that the Erinyes are hideous women, wrathful hounds that look like gorgons, surrounded by serpents amid their dark clothing. They drip a loathsome fluid from their eyes. He can see their numbers increasing and seems to be filled with fear, since later on the chorus tells him not to be afraid. And unlike the chorus who can't see them, he sees them clearly. And to avoid them, he physically backs away from them, saying, I'm being driven away, I can't stay here. So from these two scenes, we can conclude that the Erinyes are disgusting, viscerally revolting, impure, and indescribable. The reactions of both the Pythia and Orestes can only be described as horror, fear plus revulsion that manifests physiologically. And as the external audience, we, and maybe that ancient audience that, maybe had a bunch of miscarriages and fainted everywhere, they feel the same emotional reaction that, the Pythia and Orestes do. And so basically, this just seems like they're horror monsters and that we should be thinking about this as horror. So section 3, fusion and massification. So Aeschylus, I think, employs a range of techniques intended to increase the horror of the Erinyes. And in this section, I'm just going to talk about two, fusion and massification. I think it's pretty clear that they're horror monsters. So on Carroll's theory, horror monsters must be threatening and impure. And I take it as a given that they're threatening, like they seem pretty threatening. For the impurity of the monster, Carroll lays out some typical strategies that you can make horror monsters out of. And so he says that impurity involves a conflict between multiple cultural categories. And he's basically got two types, fusion and fission. He says that fusion is when you've got categorically contradictory elements fused into a single being. And then fission is when they're distributed over different identities. So if you've got things fused together, this will make things like mummies, vampires, ghosts, centaurs, the Minotaur, two things but put together into one. And then fission is the exact opposite. It's got one thing that's split over two. So this would be things like doppelgangers, alter egos, or various kinds of shapeshifters. Okay, so clearly the Erinyes are fusion monsters. But here they're composed in a really interesting way. Okay, so most of the ones I just mentioned, you've got like two things fused together, or maybe three. But the Erinyes are more complex. At various points, they're compared to and reflect the features of many different life forms. Women, gorgons, which maybe has a snake-like quality. Harpies, which maybe has like a bird-like quality. Another point, they're called serpents. They're compared to goats. They're compared to hounds. They're compared to beasts. And so one scholar even speculated that he's like, they must have looked like bats. That was he put all that together. It's like, they look like bats for some reason. I don't quite think that, but there's some sort of fused figure. And so while the quantity of elements involved is certainly significant, that's a lot of stuff being fused together. It's also important to note the manner of their composite body. So the standard formula for hybrid monsters in ancient Greece is simply just to plug the two next to each other, right? You've got a Minotaur, which is half bull, half man. There's a bull part and a man part. But this, it's really different. They're kind of fused together to create a new creature altogether. And a modern parallel might be the xenomorph from Ridley Scott's Alien, to cite one of my most favorite horror movies, which similarly coalesces elements from a variety of life forms into a distinctly new creature. And so this depiction of the Erinyes seems to have been an invention by Aeschylus. He's the first person to have done it, as best we can tell. The earlier Greek literary sources, don't have much to say about what they looked like. And we can look to the artwork, to vase paintings, but here they're described as serpents rising above the graves of murder victims. So they look like little snake things. And, but this is the first time that we've got them represented as these, horror monsters. And so if Aeschylus consciously crafted this depiction of the Erinyes, one reason might be that he wanted to make it more horrifying. So the second technique he uses is massification. This is the idea that a mass of repellent creatures is more horrifying than a single one. So horror movies, as we've seen, they use this a lot. Hordes of spiders, swarms of bees, flocks of birds, think back to Hitchcock or something like that. If the horror film Alien is horrifying because of the single xenomorph alien, then its sequel Aliens is all the more horrifying because it's got, tons and tons of them. Okay, so if we turn to the Erinyes, it's clear that they are massified, especially in relation to audience expectations. So Greek texts before Aeschylus refer either to a single Erinyes or multiple ones, but the exact number is never specified. Our first indication of the number of Erinyes appears in Euripides, where the number is set at 3. And that was the canonical number afterwards. Eventually, they got names, Alecto, Tisiphone, and Megaera. But what about the time Aeschylus was writing, about 40 or 50 years before that? So some evidence comes from a vase painting. This is a vase painting that we've got. This shows Erinyes. And just to illustrate, from left to right, we have an Erinyes, then Hecate with dogs. That's the goddess of witchcraft, and then an Erinyes. So we've got Hecate sort of in the middle, surrounded by these 3 Erinyes. And they look like women, but with these, you see these like branch, protrusions coming out of them. They're like snake-like protrusions. And so, people have interpreted this as being like, okay, these are the Erinyes, and there's serpentine, snaky imagery coming out of them, and there's 3 of them. So this vase painting is from 470 BCE, which is, roughly speaking, just before the production of Aeschylus. So all I'm saying with this is that if we're going to have a number, it's probably going to be 3. There's going to be 3 Erinyes. And so this information can shed light on how massification works in the Oresteia. We begin with the imaginary Erinyes that only Orestes can see. Then we get the Pythia's reactions to the real-life Erinyes that she can see, but we can't. Then we see Orestes and 3 of the Erinyes emerge on the ekaklema. They're slumped over and they're sleeping. Then the ghost of Clytemnestra wakes them up. The first one gets up and then wakes the other 2 up. And so we've got 3 Erinyes moving around the stage, and that should really be it. According to like what our expectations would be, that's it. But then more and more Erinyes emerge out of the Skene building, one by one, until we get the whole full chorus of 12 Erinyes. And so this process probably took a while. It occupies maybe like 20 or 30 lines within the text. And it probably can make more sense of the anecdote that Aeschylus, by leading out the chorus one by one, he terrified the people so much that the children fainted and the fetuses were aborted. And so this staggered presentation massifies the monsters beyond the expectations of the audience. They most likely would have thought that there was going to be 3 and not 12, but then surprise, there's 12. Okay, so I think that this sort of indicates that they would have felt a lot of horror and when they saw this. So who knows? Maybe it's true. As a fun fact side note, there's an article that I read that said that in the 1700s there was a production of Shakespeare's Othello in Hamburg, Germany, where there was a news clipping that said that afterwards everyone fainted during the play and that all of the women in Hamburg had miscarriages afterwards. So who knows? Maybe it happened. Okay. Probably not. That still seems pretty unlikely, but who knows? So, okay. Section 4, suspense. So now we've established that the Erinyes are horror monsters. They're horror monsters with some fusion and massification. So now I'd like to look at how he does some suspense. Horror is strongly connected to suspense. The tentative feeling that something's wrong, the sense that the monster is approaching, the mystery as to who the monster is and why they're doing what they're doing. Broadly speaking, horror uses suspense to move from a state of mystery to a state of knowledge. At the beginning, a work of horror, distances the horror monster. You don't think the monster exists at all, or maybe you've got some urban legends about the monster, but you don't know much. Information about the monster is vague, unclear, imperfect. The first physical appearance of the monster, you generally only see like a brief glimpse of it, or it's really dark and in shadows and you can't quite get a good look. And that preserves the mystery of the monster. But bit by bit over the course of the horror film, piece by piece, more information about the monster's nature and what it can do and what it looks like. That's all revealed through various narrative techniques. And then ultimately, there's a revelation where the monster is fully unmasked in a moment of transcendent horror. So I'm going to say that my argument here is that Aeschylus creates suspense in that exact same way with the Erinyes, that he's using horror suspense techniques. And to see this, I'll examine how Aeschylus foreshadows the arrival of the Erinyes and how he gives some more information about them and how this culminates in two key moments of transcendent horror in Eumenides. One of them is the one I've already talked about, the arrival of these Erinyes as real physical entities on stage, and then their subsequent magical binding song. So they're going to cast some magic on Orestes or try to do that. So first, we're going to look at the first play in the trilogy, Agamemnon. And broadly speaking, it begins by presenting the Erinyes as general entities of vengeance that are temporally and spatially quite remote. Like these are not here right now. And it ends by them being presented as specific entities affecting this particular family, the house of Atreus, right here and now. So the first mention of the Erinyes is when Agamemnon and Menelaus are compared to an Erinyes. Here, it's only like a general something to do with vengeance. It's vengeance for an abduction, not even for murder the way that the Furies, the Erinyes normally are. A little bit later, we find out from the prophet Calchas that Agamemnon's sacrifice of Iphigenia, which was the thing that started the whole Trojan War to begin with and got them over there, would result in a fearsome, guileful keeper of the house, a wrath that remembers and will avenge a child. And so this phrasing evokes the Erinyes, specifying that they punish murderers and that they all also become equated with Clytemnestra, who will bring this prophecy to pass and avenge the child Iphigenia. In the next corolode, new powers are revealed. They corrode life and can pursue murderers to the underworld after death. It's already pretty frightening in all honesty. Next, the herald states that when a messenger reveals to the city that their army's been killed, it's fitting to sing this paean to the Erinyes. And this introduces a theme of what I'll call musical disharmony. There's something wrong about the music associated with them. So paeans are normally songs of joy and happiness, but for the Erinyes, what causes joy is a massive loss of life, like a whole army being destroyed. Later, the chorus describes a spirit coming to Troy that brought a bitter end to the marriage, having come to the family of Priam as an evil settler and evil companion, sent by Zeus, the god of hospitality, and Erinyes, who made brides weep. So this passage has the idea that the Erinyes can settle in and prey on families and households. The next corolode, the chorus is still feeling unsettled. They say, yet still within me, my soul, self-taught, sings out the Erinyes' lyreless lament. And so here he's, again, musical disharmony once again. He's associating the Erinyes with a lyreless lament that affects the chorus' soul deeply and instinctively. It's as if the Erinyes are psychologically affecting them and they have no ability to control it. And then later when Cassandra's describing a net of death descending upon the house, now we finally see that the Erinyes are affecting this specific family in this household. And Cassandra, this priestess, she gives this description that's really interesting. This is the most vivid description in the whole play. And it's spoken clearly so that everyone can understand, what she's saying. She says, there's a group of singers that never leaves the house. They sing in unison, but not pleasantly, for their words speak of evil. Moreover, this revel band drinks human blood, thus emboldening itself, and then remains in the house, hard to send away, this band of the house's kindred Erinyes. Besetting the chambers of this house, they sing a song of the ruinous folly that first began it all, and one after another they show their abhorrence of the brother's bed that worked harm to him who defiled it. So this is the first moment in the whole trilogy where the audience starts to think that the Erinyes might actually be affecting this house in a real way. The audience already knows that the Erinyes are agents of vengeance who pursue murderers, who are black and corrode life, who pursue murderers even after death, who delight in the massive loss of life, who are musically disharmonious, who affect families and households, who affect people's minds and souls, and finally, who affect this specific family in this household, the house of Atreus. But Cassandra's prophecy adds some new details. Not only do they corrode life, they drink human blood that emboldens them. They're a group of singers, who evilly sing in unison. And note that they're described as being a chorus, which foreshadows what they're going to be in Eumenides. They're going to be the actual theatrical chorus. And maybe most worrisomely, not only do they affect the household, they never leave the house and are hard to send away. And the Erinyes basically are becoming increasingly present and increasingly like horror monsters. And at the end of the play, both Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, they lay rhetorical claim to the Erinyes. They've just killed Agamemnon, and so they're trying to justify it, give some justification for it. Clytemnestra claims that the Erinyes helped her kill Agamemnon, gives her a sense of righteous justice. And, Aegisthus kind of corroborates the same sort of thing. He says, I've seen this man lying in the woven snare of the Erinyes. And here we learn the methods by which the Erinyes are doing this, something about this woven snare that's going to surround him. This is probably referring to the cloths, if you remember this play, that Agamemnon stepped on earlier, these like rich purple cloths. So Agamemnon establishes the Erinyes as monstrous figures with the capacity to be horror monsters, if they were to ever appear. But they're so far away, they're distant. The references to the Erinyes are put in the mouths of minor characters who are speaking in metaphors, or in prophets, who might know things that we don't, or in major characters who are just kind of laying claim to them, rhetorical claim to them. But there is nowhere any indication that the Erinyes will ever appear in the Oresteia other as like metaphors. Okay. In Libation Bearers, the second play in the trilogy, we move from a conception of them as metaphorical to real but purely psychological threats. So we learn more about the abilities of the Erinyes. They give dreadful afflictions and ulcers, attacking the flesh, eating away its pristine appearance with savage jaws, and short white hairs arising on the disease site, as well as madness and empty nighttime terrors that result in their victim cruelly shivered in a death of total decay. We know already that the Erinyes pursue murders, but here we learn that what specifically attracts them is when drops of gore flow on the ground. The Erinyes drinking blood and gore returns when Orestes declares his plan to kill Aegisthus. He says, I'll make a corpse of him, draping him around with my swift sword, and the Erinyes, who have no shortage of gore, will drink a third draught of unmixed blood. And, basically the final scene is what we get when the Erinyes finally do come after him, but they exist seemingly only psychologically. They exist only in Orestes' imagination. So Libation Bearers presents the Erinyes similarly to Agamemnon, references still appearing in dreams and oracles and rhetorical claims about righteous vengeance. The only difference, which is actually really striking, occurs at the end when the Erinyes begin to afflict Orestes, but even here it's only within his mind. There's no indication that the Erinyes will ever appear physically in the play. And then we get to the Eumenides, the play where they actually do appear. And so this shifts from them, the conception of the Erinyes as psychological, but now they're real physical entities right here, right now. So I've discussed these initial scenes earlier, but here I'd like to add how their arrival breaks the rules that Aeschylus established for their existence. The first two plays were dedicated to the idea that they were metaphorical, that they could be accessed in dreams or by oracles and prophets, and that they could be invoked as a means of bestowing a sense of righteousness, and that they were nothing but imagined hallucinations. When the Pythia sees the Erinyes at the beginning of the Eumenides, this still aligns with the rules Aeschylus had established. The Erinyes were visible to a priestess of Apollo who has special access to the divine through hallucinations. That's what the Pythia is all about. It's only when we start to see them ourselves that Aeschylus has broken the rules that have been established, and we reach our first moment of transcendent horror. And I think to fully grasp the significance of the moment of like what it would feel like, we can look to an example of modern horror in a famous scene from a horror movie called The Ring. This is a movie that came out in 2002, The Ring, where the ghost Samara, who previously had only ever been seen in videotapes, she actually emerges out of the videotape and out of the television into the real world and kills someone, thus breaking the expectations of the characters within the film and also us ourselves. And when I saw this movie for the first time, it really freaked me out. So subsequent information about the Erinyes stretches our understanding of what's possible. So not only do they physically exist, like they're real, they're here, they can make noises. when the ghost of Clytemnestra wakes them up, they make some sort of whining noise, a mugmos, and then some sort of moaning noise, an ogmos, and then a double sharp whine. Not only can they like make grunts and noises, they can speak words. They say labe, 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 which is Greek for like get him, get him, get him, get him. Not only can they speak basic Greek words, they can use full sentences and they can make rational arguments. When when Apollo accosts the Erinyes, he vividly describes where they belong. He says, "You belong where there are head-chopping, eye-gouging judgments and slaughters, where eunuchs are punished by the destruction of their children's seed, where there's a mutilation of extremities and stoning, and where men moan with long and piteous cries after being impaled under the spine." The Erinyes pursue Orestes around the stage, hunting for him and hounding him until he reaches sanctuary at the temple of Athena Polias in Athens. And even here, they describe in great detail what they want to do to him. They say, "No, you must give in return a thick red liquid from your limbs for us to slurp from your living body. From you may I draw the nourishment of a draught horrid to drink. And having drained you dry while you live, I shall haul you off below so that you may pay the suffering and the penalty of your matricide." Very dark stuff right there. And even though they can't touch Orestes, they still attempt to attack him by encircling him and singing a magical binding song, intended to destroy his mind and shrivel him up. This scene is the second and last moment of transcendental horror in the play, and it draws together a number of themes we've been talking about so far. They sing a song without a lyre, which is musically disharmonious. They talk of insanity and derangement. They describe their ability to enfeeble and drain blood and pursue murderers of kin beyond the grave. They claim their ancestral rights to do so. They highlight their lack of commonality with the immortal gods and the fact that Zeus has deemed them unworthy of his company. Instead, they carry out their despised function in the sunless slime. On a performative level, the image of the Erinyes encircling Orestes in this magical binding song recalls a few earlier moments from the Oresteia. These are uncanny apparitions or flashes. They're performative moments that foreshadow the horrifying circular arrangement of the Erinyes around Orestes in the binding song. And there's 3 of these. The first is from Agamemnon, when the servants of the house, the Demoi, are spreading out the woven cloths that the Erinyes used to ensnare Agamemnon. And Emanuela Bacola suggests that they might have been arranged in a circle as they kind of laid out this cloth. The second's at the beginning of Libation Bears, when those same Demoi become the chorus in the second play. They appear clad in black with gashes on their cheeks and torn and destroyed fabrics, looking increasingly similar to the Erinyes. And then at the end of Libation Bears, when Orestes asks that the same chorus, spread it out and standing around it in a circle, display the fabric which covered the man. And then the blocking here would probably look the same with them all in a circle surrounding him. And so soon after, the Erinyes appear to Orestes, and it seems like he conflates them, the Erinyes in his mind, with this chorus of the women in front of him. And so this basically, to me, seems like the evidence for that final moment of transcendental horror. So collapse and renewal. So the Oresteia is really, it's a trilogy about family trauma, really is what it is. Going back to the cycle of vengeance caused by the curse of the house of Atreus. And there's a big list right there that you can see of all these mythological figures just murdering and betraying and being terrible to each other. And since this family are the political leaders of Greece, within this family, we've got kings of Pisa, Olympia, and Mycenae. The collapse of the family threatens the collapse of society. And so this is one fundamental question raised by the trilogy. What can stop the cycle of vengeance? What can stave off the collapse? And what can cause the renewal? Typically, the answer given is that it's Athens to the rescue, especially the arrival of the Athenian court system, which promises to be fair and democratic. But I think it's important to note that in Aeschylus, it requires a monster to bring this about. After all, the moment of crisis is the moment at which the monster emerges. And even though the entire trilogy builds suspense for the Erinyes, they're really only on stage as horror monsters for a really short period of time, maybe about the first half of the Eumenides. And notice what happens to the Erinyes in the second half of the play, after Orestes wins the trial and Athena invites the Erinyes to live in Athens. They become naturalized into the Athenian world. They're symbolically granted medic or resident alien status. by the provision of purple cloaks, which were worn by medics in the Panathenaic procession. Athena calls them medics, and the Erinyes call their newfound relationship metoikia, this relationship of being a medic. So what happens to their status as horror monsters at this point? Do they still evoke fear and disgust? The evidence is a little conflicting. So on the one hand, they promise to give blessings and protection to the land. But on the other hand, there's the potential to cause further harm that they're worried about. Athena fears that they will send down grievous wrath upon the land and to create sterility by releasing a dripping liquid from your lungs to make a savage froth that devours the seed. I mean, this is to say that Athena is concerned about the time of collapse continuing. But they do have a place in Athens now. They're given an underground abode. And remember earlier, they were thought of as not having a place. And that was part of what made them feel like horror monsters. They have no place among gods, men, or beasts. And so all this gives us reason to think that, now the Erinyes are living within Athens. To use Carol's language, they're, maybe less Dracula and more Chewbacca. They're not quite so scary anymore. And this ending where the main characters end up coexisting with the horror monster more or less peacefully is kind of unusual. It's kind of weird to live with the horror monster afterwards. But there's at least one parallel in the film, The Babadook from 2014, which ends with the protagonist Amelia locking the monstrous Babadook in her basement and even giving food to it down in the basement and it's living there for a while. So ultimately, we can interpret the Oresteia as illustrating something consistent with Gramsci's principle, that what enables us to move from collapse to renewal is not just the time of monsters, but the time of horror monsters. So thank you.
Oh,
Thank you very much, Craig, for a stimulating, fascinating lecture. Are there any questions from folks for Craig?
I don't.
John.
Oh, sorry.
John, I see a hand up. Then Katie, then Matt.
That wasn't my hand up. That was applauding.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Katie.
But that's all right. I would be happy. I'm happy to applaud. That was really interesting.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Am I next?
Yeah, you do have a hand up. I'm Miss. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Of course, when we talk about three sort of horror females, all I can think of is the witches from Macbeth. And do we have any evidence that Shakespeare was reading Aeschylus? I mean, we know the Roman authors were circulating, but were the Greek authors circulating too by then?
Yeah, the Greek authors were circulating for sure. And Shakespeare kind of very famously says that he knows little Latin and no Greek, less Greek. So so obviously Shakespeare is very much influenced by primarily more Roman drama than Greek drama, but there's always the chance that some of that might have filtered through stories and things like that. So certainly the idea of Macbeth using witches does come from this long tradition of ancient witchcraft, people like Medea or Circe or things like that. But to me, I don't know if there's any evidence that he was reading Aeschylus specifically. Yeah, but that's the same sort of effect, that same kind of horror effect is with the witches in Macbeth. Yeah, that's a great parallel.
Thank you.
but
Craig, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. While you were going through and showing images and depictions in artwork when you went to the vase, I was scrolling through, and I'm fortunate enough to live in Boston, and I often take students to the Museum of Fine Arts, and there's the murals, the frescoes by John Singer Sargent, and he has a beautiful Art Deco depiction of that scene when they've morphed into 12. And I was checking, and in that scene, they are holding snakes in their hands, and they have torches in their other hand. I didn't check to see which hand it was, but it's in the grand entryway to the MFA. Those and I'm aware you're from Massachusetts originally. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, thank you. That was outstanding. I just wanted to point that out. It's a very cool depiction and
It's so cool.
worth checking out. Thank you.
Yeah, and the idea of them like holding snakes in their hands is even cooler because if then it's like threatening to throw the snakes at you or something. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I am from Massachusetts originally. I grew up right near Springfield in Agawam, Mass.
Fred?
Craig, so that the increase from 3 to 12 represents the mass that the gradually increasing mass. I when exactly does that happen? I do we see that? Is it in the Eumenides or the libation bearers?
It's in Eumenides. So basically, right after the scene where the Pythia it sees them herself and she's shocked, then a 100, 200 lines later, that's when we see Clytemnestra as a ghost because she's been killed already in the previous play. She comes up and wakes up one of these Erinyes. The way we think it was staged is there's this device called the ekaklema, which is a theatrical rolly-outy machine and like a wheeled platform. And so we think that there was 3 Erinyes kind of on this ekaklema, and she wakes one of them up, it gets up, and then wakes the other 2 up. And then from the sides comes the remaining 12. And then all of a sudden they all kind of, come down and coalesce, and now we've got these 12. And then all of a sudden we realize, oh, they're the chorus. Not only are they like, maybe like sleeping or dead monsters on a platform, but no, they're the chorus of this play. And they're going to be singing and talking and doing all sorts of stuff. So that's the part where I'm talking about where I'm like, this is breaking everyone's expectations. And it probably would have been quite a striking thing. There's no other chorus in Greek tragedy that's really remotely like this. And so this seems to have been like a one and done, like that. He did it. Aeschylus did it. That's how you do the horror monster chorus, move.
And no one needs to do it again.
No one needs to. He did it. It's like the Wizard of Oz. You go from black and white to color, and everyone's like, nope, that was the magical moment. You don't need to do that again.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
John?
Actually, we're just using one computer, so this is Anne. I thought that was a really interesting talk. I have a question, and it's about that particular scene with the Erinyes then expanding slowly to be 12 and then becoming the chorus. And that, I think you said, was the famous time when people fainted and women had miscarriages and so on. And I'm wondering if it could possibly have been that, okay, everybody knew there were going to be 3. And then more and more come out. And so I think the horror could also have been for the contemporary audience that suddenly you have more and more of them coming. So, and that makes it real. This isn't acting anymore. They've somehow managed to release the actual Eumenides, and that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that thought that the Erinyes are real and that they're here right now is something that would have made them horrified. And so I think that's definitely a part of it. There's always that when you're watching a theater, obviously you're watching something that is not real, it's fake, right? But then there's these little moments that sometimes it just, maybe in a horror movie, there's a jump scare and you jump, like you think, you don't really think it's going to jump out at you, but you sort of, you react the same sort of way. And so the thought probably crosses your head, oh, the Furies are here now,
Especially when more and more of them keep coming out.
Yeah, right. And it's each one comes out, you're like, oh my God, there's 4. Oh my God, there's 5. Uh-oh, and it just kind of keeps going. Yeah.
Can you yeah, thank you. I don't know how to make the that was very interesting. What one of the things that I never thought of this as a horror movie before, that now it makes me also wonder about the importance of music in horror movies, and since these were musical performances,
Yeah.
would the music have done the same thing which you would see whether it's Jaws or Psycho or something, where the music actually causes suspense
Mm.
and fear and fright in a way that we hadn't thought of before? So I think that's really interesting.
That's a great question. I saw a little thing on a like a little YouTube video. It was a horror movie, but they changed the soundtrack and it was like super funny instead, right? And so yeah, it makes you aware that, yeah, that music plays a big part,
Mm.
just like lighting does and everything else does in the making of a movie. So we don't have any of the ancient music for this one. We do have this strand, like a theme that I'm calling the musical disharmony, that they're being described as being disharmonious. Like the stuff that they sing songs about aren't right. They're playing a lyre to, or they're not playing a lyre to things that should have a lyre and that sort of thing. So I think the theme conceptually is there, but I don't have any good evidence about the music itself being horrifying. That'd be hard for me to actually prove, but it might actually be worth me trying to figure it out and look at because you'd have to look at the meter actually to try to see if any horrifying effects. I don't know what horrifying metrical effects would look like, but to try to see if there might be. But that's a great idea. Yeah.
Craig, I had a question. I was thinking about the other play where the Eumenides play kind of a role, even though they don't appear, the Oedipus at Colonus, because it's in their shrine where Oedipus ends up. And there are some ways where we can think of Oedipus as monstrous or someone who's done monstrous things. And certainly you can draw the House of Laius has its own issues, like the House of Pelops. And in a sense, again, here comes Athens at the end to try to set things right. Do you think that maybe there's some interplay there with Sophocles looking at Aeschylus and the monstrous there? Because at the beginning of the play, he was very worried. Oh, you definitely don't want to offend these goddesses. You shouldn't have stepped there.
Yeah.
And part of it getting them to accept uh, Oedipus in kind of a similar role as to where the Eumenides end up at the end of Aeschylus's play as a protective hero of sorts for Athens.
Yeah. That's a very good point. So the first thing I'll say is that throughout Greek tragedy, if you're going to kind of make a reference to something that might be horrifying or scary, the number one thing you would allude to is the Furies, the Erinyes. We see this sporadically throughout. The other one would be the Bacchae, or Maenads, who rip apart Pentheus, right, and Eurydice Bacchae. So those are the two big ones that you would kind of point to. I do think that Oedipus is monstrous. If I was giving in fact, I gave a talk of a few years back on Oedipus the monster, where I was talking about more in Oedipus Rex, Oedipus Tyrannus, not Oedipus at Colonus. But he is, right? I mean, the sort of stuff that he's done and the kind of roles that he plays, he's doing very monstrous sort of things. It's just that he's not a physical sci-fi supernatural monster. He's a human monster that's doing that same sort of stuff. In the same way that you would have, horror movies, like Norman Bates from Psycho or Hannibal Lecter from Silence of the Lambs, right? They're not supernatural monsters, but they create that emotion in us, that same horror emotion, because of the sorts of people they are and the sorts of stuff they do. And so I think Oedipus is that same sort of figure. But I had not thought about the idea of that parallel between OC and Eumenides in terms of the role that they're playing. So that's a very...
I mean, honestly, I didn't even think of that until I just started saying it too, right? I was like, wait a second, there's a parallel there too. Yeah.
Sometimes great ideas come from that, Mark,
Yeah. Hey, do we have any other questions for Craig? Well, I don't see any answer. So, Craig, I want to thank you so much for a tremendous start to our lecture series this year. This was fascinating, and I am really looking forward, to the book project that this sounds like it will turn into. So I want to applaud once again, get the right reaction going here. And thank you so much. For everyone else, I hope you had a great first day. And it turns out I actually don't have jury duty tomorrow now. It got canceled on me. So I will be I'll be here all day tomorrow too. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And we'll see you tomorrow morning.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you
Safe
so much.
travels.